Welcome to The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a public charter high school in the Bronx.
I'm Nique Faziours, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI and an adjunct professor at Rice Business School and WashU Olin Business School.
Nique, always great to see you. And for a new episode of The Invisible Men, we are very excited to actually have a return guest from 3 years ago, and many things have changed for the great Delano Squires. So Delano is now a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's a writer for Blaze Media. You can hear him on Blaze TV's Fearless podcast because Delano has some of the hottest takes on family, faith, fatherhood in general, but particularly for the Black family. So Delano, welcome to The Invisible Men.
Well, welcome back, you mean? But yes, thank you. Thank
Yes.
you, guys. It's good to see you. Good to
Yes.
see we're all here, standing strong 3 years
Standing
later.
strong. Standing strong in some crazy times.
Yes, definitely. So glad to be back.
So I hear you were, you're putting some pen to paper. You recently wrote a piece about Malcolm X, but I also hear you putting together a book tentatively titled Black Wives Matter. Which I love that title. So tell your editor, I think a lot of people would dig that title. But why do you think it's time for a book that's called or themed Black Wives Matter?
Well, I think the issue of the Black family is one that people talk about a lot. And I wanted to, as you said, put pen to paper. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time. I mean, I've been writing about this issue for well over a decade. Actually, I first got started writing for a website called Black and Married with Kids. And I think basically, I think the state of the family in general, but the Black family in particular, the state of the Black family is the new civil rights issue within the Black community. And I think it's by far, the most important social issue facing Black America today.
And arguably America in general.
Correct. People talk about the out of wedlock birth rate in Black America, among Black Americans, which is 70%. But for all Americans, it's 40%. So no one is particularly doing well in this area.
Equal opportunity tsunami.
Yes, but particularly in our community, 70% of Black children are born to unmarried parents. About 45% of Black children are raised by a single mother. These are all, only less than 30% of all Black households are married couple households, compared to 47% for the national average, and the high is among Asian Americans, which is about 63% of Asian households are married couple households. And the correlation between that, right, household composition, median income, it's always the same pattern, right? Asian, white, Hispanic, Black. And I think one of the things that we need to do, particularly, as there's so many voices on the left that say focus on, inequality, inequity, this is caused by racial discrimination, is to say, no, a lot of this is caused by marriage inequality, and the fact that marriage as an institution, and the family as the natural family, the nuclear family as a structure, has largely disappeared in many Black communities. So that's why I wanted to write the book. And I talk at length, particularly in the first part, on the things that I feel that got us here. And then the second half of the book, I talk about how we move forward.
Yeah. I mean, you just recited the litany of statistics that, we don't hear it enough. Some people kind of poo-poo it, all the negative things that have happened with Black families, but most people don't realize that for Black married couples, for as long as the data has been collected, the poverty rate has been in the low single digits for Black married couples for three or more decades, right? Why does that not get the kind of attention that it should be? And then how does this connect to then Black wives matter as opposed to Black men matter, Black family? But you're focusing on Black wives.
I think the reason it doesn't get attention is because over the course of decades, particularly among the Black leadership class, there is an intense focus on structural systemic racism and income inequality. So they the people with three names, as our friend Glenn Lowry would call them, right? The Nicole Hannah Jones, the Ta-Nehisi Coates, the Ibram X. Kendi. For them, it's always those two issues, right? Everything is always systemic or structural in nature, which means for them, all of the solutions either have to be bigger government or better white people. And when you talk about issues of marriage and family, it's one of the few where that framework just doesn't work. So they are the type of people who believe that any emphasis on the things that we, particularly Black folk, have to do is playing into sort of racist tropes and stereotypes, and that's why they prefer to put the emphasis on things that they feel that white people need to do. Now, I'm of the position that uplift can never be outsourced, and that's why I don't agree with that in any way, shape, or form. But understand why they would rather not focus on this issue, and that's one of the reasons why it was easy for me to write this book. The not that it's easy to write the book because writing a book is difficult. It was easy for me to choose a topic because the field is wide open. These types of books around the Black family oftentimes focus on relationship quality. My book is not doing that. You know, it's not on how to. It's not five love languages, but a little bit more melanated, right? I'm looking at some of the factors that got us here, and actually the subtitle. I'm glad you. The title is Black Wives Matter, right? And certainly I'm playing on the name recognition of Black Lives Matter. The subtitle is Why Black Men Must Lead in Rebuilding the Family Structure Liberals Destroyed. And I think that subtitle may, pique a lot of people's interest. And it's not me just being unnecessarily partisan. I argue in the book, and my first chapter is on the impact that slavery had on the Black family, because I know that's where particularly a lot of progressives will go. And I acknowledge that it certainly had a profound impact. But I characterize it this way: slavery disrupted, um, dismantled, oftentimes, and certainly distorted and deformed the Black family. But it didn't destroy it, because the institution of slavery, the institution of marriage are two completely irreconcilable institutions. But the racist was a hostile enemy to the Black family. And when you're faced with a hostile enemy, your natural reaction is to fight. But as I move from chapter one into my subsequent chapters, I argue that six groups that I sort of group under that large umbrella liberal really did work to undermine the traditional family structure. There are paternalists, so these are big government sort of welfare state folks, right? So I talk about a lot of stuff that was going on in the 60s. So these are the people who believe that the government can play the role of husband and father to millions of particularly low income unmarried women. You have your feminists, and they're going to hate this book because I spent a whole chapter dedicated to particularly second wave feminism that sold women on the notion that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic, marriage is oppressive, the home is a prison, and children are a burden.
Mm.
You have your abortionists, and I cover that in the other chapter, which again completely undermines the notion that life has inherent value and that there's sanctity and dignity of life. You have your pride activists who have wanted to change the very definitions of not just what a marriage is, but what a human person is. So now we're at the point where college professors look you in the face and tell you that men can get pregnant, and mock and ridicule you if you choose not to believe them. You have your anti-racists, right? Again, some of the people with three names, and these are sort of Black leaders who should be talking about this issue, but again, choose to focus all their attention on what white people are or are not doing. And then the last group, you have functional atheists, many of whom are self-professed Christians, who, even though they are married themselves and believe in the institution of marriage and family and promote the Black family, are very uncomfortable making moral claims, moral appeals on this particular issue, and would rather just sort of live and let live and leave everyone to do what it is that they want to do. So those six groups, you can see a 6-on-1 fight is not a fair fight. And the other thing, contra the racists, again, the racist is a hostile enemy. All six of those groups come to Black America as a friend and an ally. And when a friend comes to your front door, your natural inclination is to open the door and welcome them in. And all six have been welcomed in, not just through culture, but also through policy. So that's part of the argument that I make. And then I talk about how we move from there.
As you think about those six groups, do you consider one or more of them easier to turn into an ally for your cause?
A
I,
true,
I thought I
a
thought you
true.
were going to say, do I consider one or two more worthy of a rebuke and a public spanking than the other four? Um, in terms of allies, I believe the functional atheist may be able to be turned sort of most quickly because you can appeal to their, their sense of, particularly if they actually have deep religious conviction, you can appeal to that. There may be some space among the anti-racists if they agree with my framing of the black family as a civil rights issue, and I connect in the book the South Side of Chicago to Selma, basically saying if you care about the plight of black folk, you should care as much about family structure on the South Side as you did about political rights in the 1960s in Selma. So if they agree with that framing and they agree with the child being the rights holder, the child being the one that says, look, I have a right to the affection, protection, and direction of the man and woman who created me. And that right is best exercised in a loving, low conflict home with my married mom and dad. I, the child, am the one who has a right. You all, the people who created me, have obligations. The reverse does not hold true. No adult has a right to a child that they can't create on their own, right? So if they agree with that framing, I think the anti-racists could be swayed. But I think the paternalists and the feminists, who I put most of the responsibility on, are least likely to be swayed with my arguments, because those two set up their own sort of parallel family structure again, starting in the 1960s. So I argue that the most significant interracial relationship in the history of this country is not, cataloged in Loving versus Virginia. It is the 60-plus-year union between black feminists and white liberals that powers the modern left. And in that, there was a distortion in family dynamics, in definitions, in responsibilities, roles, obligations that we still see play out today.
Wow. I mean, you just said something really interesting. Slavery, the institution of slavery and the institution of marriage, but that slavery didn't destroy the black family. And if you look at the data, the early part of last century, black marriage rates were actually higher than
Hmm.
almost every other ethnic group.
Hmm.
How do you think we need to use that history to remind everyone of what is possible from a time when literally racism was enshrined into law?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think sort of reaching back to the past, and that's why in the title and in the book, I'm constantly talking about rebuilding, recreating, because I think it's important that people understand that what we see today was not always the case. I think for the average American, black or white, we tend to think, slavery, emancipation, Jim Crow for a few minutes, and then like civil rights era. But to your point, Ian, from the point of emancipation, you're talking about 1863 through the early 1900s, and certainly in the immediate part after slavery was abolished, black men and women were doing everything that they could to put their families back together. In fact, one of the things that I talk about in the book is there was an entire sort of series of ads placed in newspapers across the country, particularly in the South, with men and women trying to find family members. Now, sometimes it was a parent, sometimes it was a child, but oftentimes it was a spouse. And these people were willing to travel thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of miles to put their families back together. Right? And sometimes a man may find his wife and she may have been remarried. One of the things, as I was doing research for the book, I kept coming across these stories about Enoch Arden, a Negro Enoch Arden finds his, and that actually is a reference to a poem of an Englishman who basically was lost at sea. His wife thought had died, and she remarried. And it's actually part of the law, it's Enoch Arden doctrine. If a spouse is away for long enough, the person can basically dissolve the marriage and remarry. And some of the guys, the men who found their spouses, the women left the second husband. So that burning. Now,
Wow.
if you're the second guy, that's not a it's not a happy ending. But
But
for
still.
the but you and I
Powerful.
bring these things up to say that desire for companionship, of that desire to be loved and to be known was not something that slavery could destroy. And it's fairly easy to think about. If you're holding something of value, the least efficient way for someone to get it from you is to try to pry it from your hands, because you're going to fight them, right? It's a natural inclination. You try to open the hand, I close it. The most efficient way for them to get it from you is for them to offer you something that you think is more valuable, because then you'll just open it and drop it in their hands. Now, if I have a $5 bill and Nike wants it, and I'm a penny pincher, and he says I'm going to steal it from you, I'm going to hold on to it. But if Nike gives me $100 bill, I'll gladly trade him until I get home and I realize that it's a counterfeit, and then I'll get upset. And I think that's part of the issue that we're sort of talking about, particularly with the black family.
I was in Chicago last month with my son, and we were walking along Lake Michigan, and there were had to be at least 5 or 6 family reunions. And he and I had a conversation about it. And I said, I think this really goes back to the slave experience, and that
Mm.
reunions were so important. So what you just articulated with data really supports that gut feel I had as I was trying to explain to my son. We
Hmm.
don't play around with family reunions. That is an important matter.
I could tell you. So my family, they had a reunion in 1998. We had one. Now again, we have family still in the Caribbean, in England, obviously in the States. So it's kind of hard. My wife's family, we went to their reunion last year. Prior to COVID, aside from COVID, they had a reunion every year since 1973.
Hmm.
So this was the 50th, I think, reunion. And we were able to look at some of the programs from previous years. So I think it's good to have those connections to history. I'm not a person that believes in casting aside history, and which is why I have such deep frustrations with the people who try to manipulate history in order for their own political ends. But I do believe in honoring the past, living in the present, and building for the future. And I think reunions are one way to have
Mm,
those links established across generations.
yeah. It feels like we're at this precipice, not only within the Black community, but as a whole. We're fighting this narrative, and recently Cam Newton, the former football quarterback for I think the Carolina Panthers,
Correct.
um,
Hmm.
he was doing a therapy session, um, and he put it on the internet, and he was talking about the fact that he's got 8 kids. He loves those kids; they're beautiful kids from 3 different women that he's not married to. And he told his therapist, his fear of divorce outweighs his desire for marriage.
Hmm.
In so many words, he wants more kids. He just wants God. He just wants God to just come down and
Mm.
have him have more kids.
Yeah.
So you get and more women who are just vessels, but not his wife.
Mm.
And but and he was criticized for it, but the challenge is he's not alone in that belief as relates to marriage and children within marriage. So
Hmm.
how do you think we turn this around? Not, I mean, certainly within the Black community,
Hmm.
but even more broadly.
Well, I think part of the way you do it first is to name the issue, and part of the reason that I wanted to choose the title Black Lives Matter is because it has 100% name recognition because of the Marxist uh, group that wants to disrupt and destroy the nuclear family, right? So I think part of it is naming the issue. From there, I actually think people like Cam Newton, not Cam Newton himself, but professional athletes, entertainers, influencers, can really play a significant role. Like I've had an idea, and I think Ian, you and I may have talked about this. I would love to see each of the 4 major professional sports leagues, so NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, run ads in every city where they play, promoting marriage and fatherhood. And I would have LeBron James, face of the NBA for better part of 15, almost 20 years, be the first ad, him and his wife, Savannah, and they can have their 3 kids, and he can say, every king needs a queen. Take it from me, I would know. Something to that effect. And begin to plant different seeds because what we're trying to do, what we're talking about is really about um, planting creating a culture of marriage, a marriage and family culture. And the rules of marriage culture are similar to the ones of agriculture, right? What you plant, water, and give light to grows, and what you prune, and weed does not. And I think we've been giving light and watering all the wrong things. So I think we just need to, stop doing that and begin to plant different types of seeds. And I think if we want to get the home in order, I think 4 key houses have to also be put in order. There's the church house of religion, the schoolhouse of education, the state house of government and politics, and then the art house of media and culture. And I think those institutions which support a culture can be used for good instead of
Yeah.
mischief.
And then we need to put the outhouse and throw all the bad actors in the outhouse, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I may add that on. But none of this is going to change overnight. I don't believe in magic bullets because I've never been to a gun store that sells magic guns.
Right.
Um, so that
But how
doesn't
do
mean
you,
that we.
yeah, but how do you think
Mhm.
the decline in family structure in the white community actually does that create like a perverse opportunity to say this isn't just about black folk,
Yes, it does, and
right?
I've thought that for a long time. Um, part of this issue, and I talk about this in the book, is that the black leadership class, while not having caused this issue, has allowed it to spread. I actually call this the Tuskegee effect after the Tuskegee experiment, because most people think Tuskegee was, crackpot doctors giving bad medicine. What they were doing was withholding treatment. And in the same way, the black leadership class has failed to address this issue and has allowed the sort of disease, so to speak, to grow and to spread. And I think part of that is because they often don't want to play into sort of racist stereotypes. But if it's an issue that affects everyone, now it may not affect everyone in the same way, right? So dengue fever, West Nile, and Zika all have the same source, but they have different symptoms. So among whites, it might be higher prevalence of divorce. In a lot of low-income black communities, you're talking about couples who never get married. But I think both give us an opportunity and a space to talk about the importance of marriage, family, fatherhood in ways that it was more difficult to talk about before because people didn't want to play into stereotypes. And actually, Ian, to your point about Cam Newton, I was actually surprised at how open the criticism of him was because I'm old enough to remember a time where a particular black athlete talking about having a bunch of kids out of wedlock would be the type of thing where people say, well, I don't want to play into those stereotypes. Black men are great fathers and so on and so forth. And I'm not denying that because obviously a lot of black men are. I'm talking to two. But there was space, I think, for people to be constructively critical of him in ways that has not necessarily existed before.
That's a great point because I do remember Sean Kemp and Warren
Hmm.
Cromartie. There were a number of
Hmm.
black men that behaved similar to him, and it was sort of swept under. Evander Holyfield, he was man of the year, father of the year, and he, had 4 baby mamas. And actually, I remember in like 1991, Bobby Brown in the local Boston newspaper was given
Mm.
this big award by the Boys and Girls Club. And at the time, he had 2 or 3 baby mamas. And I wrote a piece into the Bay State Banner, which is the local black newspaper in Boston. They published it. And I said, is he really, man of the year for the Boys and Girls
Mm.
Club? And I was surprised they published it. But this issue, to your point, has been present for a while. But great insight on your part to talk about the fact that the response to Cam was more transparent and was more honest, I think, than in past. Um, I just want to say, Delano, that since our last conversation 3 years ago, it is clear that your message and your voice and your logic and discipline has even further advanced.
Mm.
You have a really important role to play, in helping us get this country to where it needs to be. And I'm really excited about your voice in this book. I wanted to pivot. You might remember we had something called the speed round
Hmm.
that we did the last time, and I looked at the questions I asked. And I didn't want to repeat them, but I think in this case, the Delano of 2024, I want to hear your answer to Malcolm or Martin.
Malcolm. And the reason why is fairly straightforward. Um, the uplift through politics approach to, racial progress in the Black community that I think has been the dominant approach, at least for the last 3, 4 decades, has not worked at all. It has allowed a small number of Black elites in media and academia and politics to ascend to the highest heights. Um, and it's not just that they don't pull everyone else up, because I don't necessarily think that that's possible. They do something even worse. I call this the reverse Robin Hood effect. They actually, from their perch, rob the poor and working class, and extract benefits from them upwards. I'll give you a perfect example of how this would work. Black Democrat running in a city for mayor, or let's say running for mayor. They say they're against school choice because it drains resources from the public school. You guys know all the argument. They cream charter schools, cream, and they crop vouchers, takes money, gives them to religious schools. So they stand against school choice, that would primarily benefit the low income, Black folks in their city. They get elected to office. They summon on Martha's Vineyard. When affirmative action is struck down, they say, well, we need racial preferences so that kids from our city can get into Harvard, knowing full well that it's not the poor kids that get into Harvard, it's their children. And not only are they making a craven and sort of self-centered argument, but they actually stand in the way of low-income parents having better access to opportunity. So I'm not bullish on politics being sort of the savior that we might have thought it was. And I think, particularly in this moment, there needs to be a revolution, particularly around self responsibility. I'm quite fine with up by your bootstraps ideology, because the alternative is to be carried, and nobody's carrying me over anybody's threshold. So, yes, if I have to choose between the two today in 2024, give me Malcolm.
Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan?
Tucker Carlson. And I'm biased because I was on Tucker Carlson's show 3 times while I was still working with DC government. And I just thought he was a fascinating figure, and I think he has a lot to say and expresses very articulately many of the frustrations of the everyday person.
And my last one is more of an agree or disagree. So back in 1997, a gentleman named Keith Richburg wrote a book, Out of America: A Black Man Confronts Africa. And in the book, and I'm going to read this, his statement was that he was thankful his ancestors were brought to America as slaves, as it allowed him to be born in the United States versus Africa. Now, I had a reaction to that back in 97. I want to get your thought. You agree with him or disagree, and why?
Um, I don't know the specific quote. I'll say this. Am I grateful to live in the United States? Yes, I am. Do I acknowledge that it where I am now came at the expense of centuries of blood, sweat, and tears of my specific forefathers, as well as the ancestors of Black Americans? Yes, I do. I acknowledge that. For me, I am thankful for God's sovereignty, and while I wish there are things about history that I can change, and I certainly don't know how history would have unfolded if things worked in a different way. I try my best to be thankful for where I am right now. So I'm not the type of person that says, you're probably not going to hear me on anybody's podcast saying, I thank God for slavery. It may be a mature way to look at things. But I understand the sentiment, and the sentiment, right, basically being grateful for what you have today is one that I agree with.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
Delano, let me try and sum up something. So it's not, for the poo-pooers out there and saying family, blah, blah, blah. It's not that you are saying that there are no barriers or that racism doesn't exist. It's just that we have a history as a people, and again, this is not just about Black people, but we have a history where when you do have strong families, strong faith, access to high quality schools, those seem to be the ingredients that allow and empower people to move forward even in the face of those barriers. Is that the thrust of what you're trying to say?
It is. I mean, there are issues, race related issues that I certainly will comment on, um, and write about, but honestly, is fairly infrequent. And the reason why is fairly simple, right? I'm a father, a husband, and father. I have 4 children. As much as I care about how people are treating them outside, my primary responsibility is to make sure that they're treating one another kindly and lovingly inside. And if my sons are calling my daughters out of their name, and my daughters are hitting one another and disrespecting their mother, Sally at school, we homeschool, but for the sake of the argument, Sally at school, her calling one of my daughters a poo poo head is not a particularly high priority of mine. So one of the reasons that I don't, talk about, racism as much as other people may necessarily like is, one, the people on the left can't seem to pin down and define their terms. So racism to them is all manner of things, right?
Right.
Including, school choice is aiding and abetting white supremacy. Being pro-life is aiding white supremacy.
Objective exams
Correct.
somehow that's racist,
Objectivity. Correct.
as
Written
opposed to
word.
maybe actually offering better schools can help prepare kids, right? Yep.
Right. So one is a difference in terms, but two, for me, more importantly, it's a difference in proximity, um, and prevalence, right? And prominence. The 3 P's: proximity, prevalence, and prominence. And as a person who lives in a majority Black county, who grew up in New York City, went to school in Pittsburgh, and lives in the DC area in a majority Black county, the opinions of a white person in Iowa, in a town in Iowa that I've never heard of, have very little to do with the everyday life that I see. And particularly when you're talking about places where the mayor, the police chief, the school superintendent, the all of the people, the executives, the legislature, the entire city council are all Black folks. I don't spend a lot of time talking about what some random white person on the internet said. So I certainly do not discount the
How did you build that
presence.
muscle? How did you build that muscle? Because
Um,
that's it right there. You're like, I don't, yeah, maybe, but what does it have to do with me?
I think there's a couple of things. Growing up in New York and growing up in Queens and spending a lot of time in Brooklyn, you know, me and my friends would talk about certain issues, and there were issues around NYPD. All right, I learned to drive in the middle of the riots for Patrick Dorismond in 1999, 2000, in the year 2000. So there have always been issues, but we just saw the things that we confronted on a day-to-day basis, and we understood that if somebody was going to threaten our physical safety, it more likely would be someone who looked like us than it was one of the police officers. The other thing is just I understand. I believe in the locus of control, and I believe in controlling the things, putting our priorities in the things that we can control. And right now, I think our priorities are completely skewed. And I define priorities and I characterize priorities as the observed, not the expressed, but the observed allocation of scarce resources. Time is a priority, energy is a priority, but so is righteous indignation. And if all of it goes towards um, sort of external forces, and every moral appeal is made to external forces, then that should really tell you something about who people prioritize. And I say this particularly about people like Ibram Kendi. All of his moral appeals: say these words, support these causes, buy these books, go to these conferences, think about these issues in a particular way, are all made towards white people. So if Kendi really is sort of a cultural physician as he sort of frames himself to be, the sign on top of his clinic says whites only. and which is ironic, given he's saying that these are the most powerful and privileged people in our society.
Wow. Wow. Well, Delano, it's always a pleasure, but we can't let you leave
Mm-hmm.
until you provide one more tidbit of information. And
Okay.
for our listeners, they may remember that the whole reason we do this podcast, the reason we call the Invisible Men, is because 30 years ago, Nique and I were at Harvard Business School during the Rodney King beatings and riots. It happened when the police were acquitted, and that Black men were seen as this endangered species. And here we were at Harvard Business School with Black men at the Harvard Graduate School of Medicine, Law, Business Education. We felt invisible.
Mm.
And we did a documentary called The Invisible Men, where we did a roundtable discussion with Professor Randall Kennedy at Harvard.
Mm.
And the Black men from the various Harvard graduate schools sat around and we provided advice to Daryl.
Mm.
Daryl, a 16-year-old imaginary Black kid who lives in forgotten USA. And the reason we did it, the reason we wanted to provide advice from the different men at Harvard graduate schools, was that we didn't think Daryl was seeing any of us, that the narrative he was hearing was that you're an endangered species. The society is rigged against you as a young Black man. Fast forward 30 plus years after George Floyd, a lot of those narratives are still emerging. So what would you say to Daryl? What's the advice for a 16-year-old Black kid who seems to be hearing one message about the possibility for his life?
Mm. So I would tell Daryl a couple of things. I would tell him. I would tell him that in order to know who you are, you have to know whose you are. And a life built on a solid biblical foundation is one best suited to stand the test of time. And this is more important now than ever, if I'm talking to Daryl, because Black identity, which is not just now about phenotype, it's not just about race, or it's not even about ethnicities, right? It's not just Black American versus Black African or Black Caribbean, Afro Caribbean. It's oftentimes a political identity. And it's important for Daryl to know this because people are going to weaponize that against him and to tell him he's being a bad Black man if he doesn't do what they want him to do. So this is why knowing whose you are is so important. So I think once Daryl knows that, I would tell Daryl, a man's natural habitat is within marriage and the family. He lives longer. He eats better. This is why you put on grown man. I'm getting some of mine off, but that's why you put on grown man weight, right? This is natural habitat, and it's where he can see his next generation starting to take form. So I would want Daryl to live his life in such a way that he gets married earlier than most people think that he should. That he understands that, again, marriage has value. It has an ideal order. Obviously, we talk about the success sequence all the time, right? There's nothing wrong with having a big family. That marriage is a lifelong covenant union, not a temporary contract. So he can't just hop out whenever, his wife burns the toast or his kids make him frustrated. But I would tell Daryl to build your life in such a way with your wife that 5 generations from now, your great, 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 great grandchildren are still benefiting from the foundation that you laid. And I'll tell him that is possible. It's not possible if you follow everyone down the road because their logic is so messed up that in one hand they'll say to be a good Black person you have to be, pro-abortion, and in the next breath they'll say, but we're about generational wealth, right? So you build wealth for generations that you've already destroyed. So that's why I want Daryl to understand whose he is first, and then build so that he lays up not just a treasure in heaven, but he leaves something for his children and his children's children.
Outstanding, Mr. Delano Squires. Great to see you. Proud
Likewise.
of you.
Thank you.
Got a lot of great work ahead for all of us, but especially for you.
Lord willing.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Invisible Men. Nique, always great to see you. And this is just one of our great episodes, and there are more to come.